In 1803, the United States purchased the territory of Louisiana from France. This was a tract of approximately 827,000 square miles extending from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the present border between the United States and Canada. This territory would one day be divided up into 15 states. But in 1815, the year that Louis William Valentine de Bourgh, a Sulpician priest, became the bishop of the Diocese of Louisiana, it was mostly wilderness territory and home to 40 to 50,000 Catholic souls. Bishop de Bourgh was first assigned to the Diocese of Louisiana as apostolic administrator in 1812. While still the bishop-elect, de Bourgh made the decision that he would not accept the appointment as bishop until he had secured priests to serve the many neglected souls of the diocese. He told Pope Pius VII,
"Holy Father, without the help of some priests, I feel I should no longer have the strength to bear the formidable burden of a diocese so vast that it is almost unlimited. I shall therefore be obliged to resign it."
Bishop de Bourgh traveled to Rome in 1815 in order to recruit priests to return with him to Louisiana. One evening when in Monte Satorio, de Bourgh heard a young Vincentian priest giving a spiritual conference to a group of clerics. So deeply impressed was the bishop-elect that he resolved to have this priest, and perhaps more of his community, for his sparsely settled diocese. The young priest's name was Felix de Andreas. Father de Andreas was a member of the Congregation of the Mission, also known as the Vincentian Order of Priests. The Congregation of the Mission was founded by St. Vincent de Paul in January of 1817. At the beginning, the primary mission of the Vincentians was the evangelization and care of the poor, especially those in the most rural of places. Through its popular missions, the priests of the congregation would provide the rural poor with an understanding of the Catholic faith and promote their participation in the sacraments, especially the sacraments of penance and Eucharist. As time went on, and in answer to divine providence, the Vincentians added other ministries to their mission, including the education and training of clergy. St. Vincent first sent his priests to Rome in 1631 as a way of having direct communications with the Holy See. By 1659, the Vincentians were able to find a permanent residence in the Monte Satorio district of Rome. Father Felix de Andreas was sent to Monte Satorio in 1806 to teach theology. He soon became integral to the program of seminary formation. One of his students, Joseph Rosati, said of Father de Andreas,
"He longed to transmit to their hearts a heavenly fire that would make them fervent apostles for the infidel souls to which they were destined."
It was during one such address to the clergy in the Piazza Colonna that Bishop de Bourgh would first hear him speak. This was to be the starting point of the American Vincentian mission. De Andreas had long wanted to serve in the foreign missions, particularly in China or America. When Bishop-elect de Bourgh spoke to the young priest and asked him to accompany him to the United States, primarily to establish a seminary in Louisiana, de Andreas enthusiastically agreed. 2 days later, de Bourgh had an audience with Pope Pius VII and received final approval for de Andreas and 5 or more other Vincentians to go to Louisiana. Father de Andreas particularly remembered his student, Joseph Rosati. He wrote to him about the mission to America, and Rosati agreed to join. A contract was made between the Bishop of Louisiana and the Vincentians on September 27, 1815. The provision stated that the missionaries would accompany Bishop de Bourgh as subjects of the Congregation of the Mission to form an establishment in his diocese. On October 14, 1815, Bishop de Bourgh gathered his little company of missionaries who would soon depart from Rome. In the initial agreement with Bishop de Bourgh, the Vincentians would establish their seminary in New Orleans, located in southern Louisiana. It would be necessary for the missionaries to study French. To facilitate this, the first destination on their journey to America would take them to Toulouse in France. The missionaries departed from Rome in 2 groups. De Andreas traveled with the group by sea, and Rosati would travel over land. The journey by sea took more than 2 months, and the missionaries arrived at Toulouse on January 19, 1816. Rosati and his small band went to France by way of the Alps, a perilous journey in the depth of winter. They joined their fellow missionaries at Toulouse on January 25, 1816. They soon set out again for Bordeaux, where they were to await the arrival of Bishop de Bourgh. They arrived in Bordeaux in early February. The missionaries stayed in Bordeaux for more than 4 months, during which they studied French. The priests had been given permission by the local bishop to carry on priestly ministry within the diocese. They spent their time ministering and preaching in the local parishes. On April 24th, a letter arrived from Bishop de Bourg informing the missionaries that he would not be traveling with them to America, and announced a new destination for them once they got there. Originally, the Vincentians were to travel to New Orleans, located in Lower Louisiana, and establish a seminary. But Bishop de Bourg had changed the location of his see to St. Louis, a city located in Upper Louisiana and more than 1,200 miles north of New Orleans. Knowledge of the English language would now be as important to the mission as French. The missionaries would have to undertake the study of a new and complex language. Bishop de Bourg finally arrived in Bordeaux on May 22, 1816, with more young men bound for America as missionaries. Arrangements were made for them to sail on a ship called the Ranger. They weighed anchor on June 12th or 13th. On board were 13 missionaries. In anticipation of the journey, Father De Andreas wrote to his superior, Father Zaccardi. In the letter he said,
"We shall go to Philadelphia or Baltimore, and thence by land some 800 leagues through the woods among mosquitoes, wolves, bears, panthers, rattlesnakes, and savages more furious than the wild beasts themselves. We shall be obliged to sleep under trees, making large fires around in order to keep off intruders."
Before boarding the ship, they made one last break with their pasts. They laid aside their cassocks and donned the black suits and round hats that were characteristic of the American clergy. The group quickly turned the ship into a floating seminary. Spiritual exercises were held with regularity, and classes were given in theology and English. Sea voyages in that age were dangerous and uncomfortable, and this one was no exception. Some were afflicted by seasickness, and they encountered at least one serious storm. The missionaries made a novena to St. Vincent and fasted. Their prayers were answered. On July 26, 1816, they arrived safely at Baltimore. De Andreas wrote,
"Our first impulse on landing was to kneel and kiss the ground, but the place where we disembarked was so crowded that we deferred doing that."
The band had landed in a foreign country with a limited command of the local language and 80 pieces of baggage. They were quickly welcomed and helped by the Sulpicians of St. Mary's Seminary. Some lodged at the seminary, while others were given hospitality in 2 local parishes. Following instructions he had received from Bishop de Bourg, De Andreas immediately wrote to Benedict Joseph Leger, also a Sulpician and Bishop of Bardstown, Kentucky. Leger quickly replied, urging the group to come to Kentucky before the onset of winter. The Sulpicians at St. Mary's took up a collection in the city to help with expenses of the journey and donated some books for the proposed seminary. De Andreas made preparations for departure. The band was again divided into 2 groups. The first, under the leadership of Brother Blanca, was to go on foot to Pittsburgh together with the wagons carrying the baggage. They departed on September 3, 1816. The second group, led by De Andreas, left by stagecoach a week later. The journey, as described by De Andreas, was harrowing. The roads were primitive and dangerous. At one point, 2 companions became lost. At another, a landslide almost killed them all. The climax came when the stage driver decided that he could not cross the flooded Juniata River and left his passengers at an inn. They eventually crossed by canoe and caught another stage on the other side. For the last segment of their trip, they were compelled to abandon the stagecoach altogether, put their possessions in a wagon, and walk to Pittsburgh. It had taken them 9 days to cover 240 miles. It is small wonder that De Andreas admitted to feelings of melancholy as he recalled the warmth and beauty of Rome. Though they were well received and lodged by both Catholics and non-Catholics in Pittsburgh, they were delayed there because Brother Blanca had not arrived with the baggage. When he did, the Ohio River was too low to permit them to take a flatboat. It was not until October 26, 1816, that the level of the river had risen sufficiently to permit their departure. The flatboat was immediately converted into another floating seminary, with a fixed schedule of spiritual exercises and classes. The missionaries had come to enjoy the beauties of the new country and stroll the riverbanks during stopovers. Rosati admired the color and variety of American birds, though he considered their song inferior to those of Europe. De Andreas, on the other hand, was more concerned with his first sighting of rattlesnakes, which he described in detail in letters to Europe. They reached Louisville on November 19, 1816. Father De Andreas continued on horseback to see Bishop Flaget in Bardstown.
He was well acquainted with Louisiana, having been there some years before, since which period he had kept up correspondence with persons resident there. We had a long way to go to reach St. Louis. The winter was rapidly approaching. We ran the risk of being stopped by the ice, besides which we needed some time to study the English language and become more perfectly acquainted with the French. The question now was whether we should go on immediately or stop. The bishop received me with the greatest kindness and convinced me that it would be very imprudent to proceed immediately to St. Louis, where, in the first place, there was nothing prepared to receive us. We therefore resolved to accept the generous offers of Bishop Flaget and to stop a while at his seminary of St. Thomas, about 4 miles from Bardstown.
The first Vincentians had arrived in Bardstown, Kentucky. As it turned out, they spent almost 2 years there. They studied theology, French, and English, and the priests ministered to Catholics scattered throughout Kentucky and Indiana. During their time in Bardstown, Father De Andreas wrote to his superior, Father Siccardi, about their ministry.
The life of a missionary in this country is pretty hard. He must be constantly on horseback, finding his way here and there through immense woods to visit the sick and attend the congregations. Sometimes he's obliged to go 30 or 40 miles to see a sick person. The congregations are what we call parishes. The people assemble in cabins built of the trunks of trees, laid one upon the other, the interstices being filled up with clay. These are our churches, without pictures or ornaments of any kind, provided merely with a poor wooden altar. They are scattered about amongst the woods, and on festival days, Catholics, and not infrequently Protestants too, for 10 or 15 miles around, gather within their walls. All come on horseback, and it is really amusing to behold the surrounding woods filled with horses, and to hear them neighing as if a regiment of cavalry were in the vicinity. Confessions take up the greater part of the morning. Mass is said or sung, a sermon or homily is preached, and then follow the baptisms, generally very numerous. The sick must be visited, and the poor priest, worn out with fasting, fatigue, the journey and the heat, has at length to beg his dinner here or there. This meal usually consists of some cornbread, beefsteak, and water, without wine, vinegar, soup, or oil. Sometimes he is obliged to say 2 masses and to preach in places far apart, for the people are very much dispersed. There are neither small towns or villages. You see no peasantry or servants. Priests are all too few for the work that has to be done, and they can barely attend to the wants of Catholics. How many die without a priest and are buried without his ministry? In this immense diocese of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio, there are scarcely 12 priests, including the bishop.
Meanwhile, Bishop Dubourg had arrived in Baltimore in September of 1817, with 28 new recruits for the mission. He sent word to Bardstown to ask Fathers De Andreas and Rosati and Bishop Flaget to St. Louis to prepare for his arrival there.
They had to travel over 300 miles on horseback, the roads in a most dreadful state so that they had lost their way once or twice and were overtaken by night in the midst of frightful precipices. Another day they were drenched by rain without having any means of drying their garments. Finally, on another occasion, they had to go without food from morning until night.
They arrived in St. Louis on October 17, 1817. At that time, St. Louis was home to 4,000 people. The streets were unpaved. The bishop and the missionaries found a rectory an old stone building almost in ruins. The nearby parish church was in similar condition. The Catholic community was being attended to only once every 3 weeks by a priest from the other side of the river.
Wherever the eye turned, nothing could be seen but poverty and desolation.
Bishop Fleget and the missionaries tried to ignite some enthusiasm for Bishop de Bourgh's arrival, almost to no avail. Many of the people were Catholics in name only, and had little interest in the fact that Bishop de Bourgh had chosen St. Louis as the see for the Diocese of Louisiana. Despite their apathy, Bishop Fleget convinced them to repair the church and to provide a suitable home for Bishop de Bourgh. Meanwhile, a delegation of 2 deputies from St. Mary's of the Barrens, a parish situated about 80 miles away, reached St. Louis with a solemn request. They had been sent by their parish priest to ask Bishop Fleget to be their intercessor with Bishop de Bourgh upon his arrival. They had already purchased 640 acres within the bounds of the parish, and now wished to offer it to Bishop de Bourgh as the location for the new seminary. Having made arrangements for Bishop de Bourgh in St. Louis, Bishop Fleget returned with Father Rosati to Bardstown, arriving on November 6, 1817. Father De Andreas, who was in delicate health, stayed at St. Genevieve, Missouri. On December 1st, Bishop de Bourgh arrived in St. Thomas. Bishop de Bourgh was determined to go immediately to his new see city, and in spite of severe weather, he departed on December 12th, accompanied by Bishop Fleget. They arrived in St. Genevieve on December 31st, 1817, where they were joined by Father De Andreas. When de Bourgh and De Andreas arrived in St. Louis on January 6, 1818, another deputation from St. Mary's of the Barrens awaited them to discuss the offer of land. By April of 1818, Bishop de Bourgh had an opportunity to visit the site personally. He was satisfied both with regard to the land and the dispositions of the people. The offer of 640 acres of land was accepted, and it was agreed that the seminary was to be established at the Barren settlement, now Perryville, Missouri. The parishioners also pledged $1,500 to be paid in 5 yearly installments toward the construction of the first house of the Congregation of the Mission in the United States and the new seminary. Back in St. Louis, Father De Andreas, now Vicar General of the diocese and pastor of the Catholic community of St. Louis, wrote again to his superior, Father Siccardi.
I write you this from the very ends of the earth, on the banks of the Mississippi. I am transported beyond myself when I consider the admirable care of divine providence in favor of this mission, and overcome by gratitude on the one hand, and confusion by reason of my unworthiness on the other. This diocese covers an immense extent of country, and the labor that it will require will soon render it expedient to divide it. Cities, towns, and villages are growing up before our eyes with marvelous rapidity. Emigrants are arriving in crowds from all parts of the United States, as well as from Europe. And in a few years, the country will become so flourishing that Europe will no longer excite envy.
But his most earnest desire was to be freed of his obligation as Vicar General, so that he might cross to the far side of the Mississippi River to work with the Native Americans. So fascinated was he at the possibility of being a missionary to the native people that he achieved some mastery of the local dialect. With the help of a native interpreter, he translated the Our Father and intended to begin a catechism. Father De Andreas was busy on other fronts as well. On December 3, 1818, he opened the first American novitiate of the Congregation of the Mission in St. Louis. He called the novitiate Gethsemane and considered it the one thing closest to his heart. At about the same time, he began teaching theology in a boys' school founded by Bishop de Bourgh. Construction of the new seminary at St. Mary's proceeded at a slow pace. Nevertheless, on September 15, 1818, 25 priests, brothers, and seminarians left St. Thomas, going by boat to the junction of the Ohio and Mississippi, and from there by land to the Barrens, arriving on October 2nd. Since the buildings were not yet ready for them, they had to lodge with some of the local people. The first structure built was a small log cabin, which is still preserved under a shelter on the grounds of the present-day Shrine of the Miraculous Medal. Eventually, 3 log cabins were constructed. From its beginnings, St. Mary's of the Barrens operated as the diocesan seminary for the entire territory of Louisiana. It was incorporated by the state of Missouri in 1823 and empowered to grant degrees in 1831. During the 19th century, St. Mary's functioned as a lay college, a Vincentian seminary, diocesan seminary, parish, working farm, and a small academy. Within a decade of the foundation of the seminary, the Vincentians began to expand across the United States. Responding to the needs of the church in America, the missionaries continued to establish small local seminaries, secondary schools, and parishes all up and down the Mississippi River Valley. They established a missionary center in Philadelphia in the east, and from there founded seminaries for diocesan clergy. Eventually, the Vincentians would expand their mission in the east to include parts of New England. They established parishes to meet the needs of the thousands of European immigrant Catholics, and they continued to preach their missions in both large cities and rural communities. Shortly after California achieved statehood, the missionaries moved west to Monterey and Los Angeles, and from there they expanded, going wherever there was need. Despite the differing challenges that they have faced in the 200 years since they first arrived in the United States, the Vincentians continue to be committed to preach the gospel to the poor, living out their vocation as true sons of St. Vincent de Paul.